Welcome to the WADT podcast. Today we kicked off a new series called Manhood 2.0, where we will talk about issues pertaining to men's mental health and relationships and many more. Our guest today and for the next few episodes is Eugene Chong. He is the principal counselling psychologist at Seeding Minds. He helps those with a mental health condition such as depression, anxiety, and trauma. He also helps couples with their strained marital relationships. In this episode, Eugene will be helping us understand anger. What are its causes and how men can manage and overcome it. Now, during the podcast, we will be announcing a promo code that you can use for something special. So keep listening to the end. Welcome, Eugene, to the WADT podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for
Hi, Eugene.
inviting me here. I think it's my pleasure to be part of this very interesting and also really important area to help men in particular.
Yes. I think you're the right person to invite onto this program and to give us a bit more understanding and insight into this, because you, I believe, have helped many people in not just this area, but many other areas as well. Now, apart from being a therapist, you are also a husband and a father of a 10-year-old boy. So now, whenever we have a father on our program, we always have a surprise question. Okay, so that's why I didn't
Wow,
forewarn
surprise
you about this. Yes, it's a surprise
Okay.
question, but I think you should be able to answer it. You're a smart guy.
It's a surprise if you have not listened to our podcast. Any of the
It's a
episodes.
surprise.
Because we ask the same question every time.
Okay.
The question
So this is really a
is,
surprise to me.
that's right. The question is, what is fatherhood to you?
Well, I think fatherhood in my own framework is not to just to be providing a bread butter, but to really be involved. So it's an involvement not just in the physical sense, in the emotional and mental sense throughout the journey with the child that you are caring for, or with kids or many kids that you're caring for. So individually, you are really involved in different areas. So to me, that's fatherhood. So it's not just being physically present, but emotionally and mentally absent.
Well said. Wow, this is a textbook answer from Center for Fathering.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't manage to look
Yes.
at the textbook from Center for Fathering.
we don't have one actually. Yeah. But well, you're spoken just like sounds like a professional father. I mean, a very good father. So I'm just wondering why you only have one child. Maybe you should have 3 or 4.
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a really good father, but I think that I'm still learning, because I think being a father and being a therapist, helping people with such issue will be really different. I think that's the point that I'm going to bring across later on about anger. But I guess that the question that you asked me earlier is that why one child? I think one is quite challenging already. For me, myself, I think having a boy, especially a boy, is rather challenging. It's of course definitely is fulfilling, but the process of that journey can be quite tough. So I think one is good enough.
All right. Well, today we're talking about anger, and so I guess it'd be useful to start with this. Why is it important to talk about anger, especially pertaining to men?
Okay, from my work and the people that I work with, right, I think anger has become really an important area that perhaps I would say many men in particular actually has been suffering from this entity or an emotion or core emotion of human being. So because men typically doesn't express themselves, so they bury this particular emotion in their life. So it is so important, because if they were to bury this for long enough, right, I'm just afraid that it will become explosive. That's where in therapy I see many men who has a anger issue, not because they have a difficulty kind of like understanding what is anger, but typically they have issues of how to manage their anger, because anger itself is not a wrong thing. I think anger is not a morally bad thing, but rather is a difficulty of one individual that find itself difficult to manage. that particular emotion.
Mm.
So that's why I think it's really important.
Maybe it'll be useful to clarify also. Anger is not character, right? It's not part of your
No.
character.
Yeah.
So it's
Anger is not a character.
you're not born that way in that sense. So you probably picked it up somehow. It got developed within you, like you talk about. We suppress our
Yeah.
emotions, and therefore you become explosive.
Yeah.
So I think that's important for many men to know that that it is therefore something you can do. Something about it and change it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So just to clarify that point, that I don't think we are born to be angry person. We are not born to be an angry individual. We are born as a very clean, very pure state. But I think as we grow, we learn certain behavior. And this behavior is typically from the people that surround us. Sometimes we call it our loved ones. Sometimes we call it our friends, our authority figures, our teachers, our mentor. So we learn all these things, all these behaviors from them. And sometimes, right, that as we learn, right, we become a representation. And I think this phrase is quite common. Is that when we talk about monkey see, monkey do. Whatever the monkey sees, they will do the same thing. So similarly, right, sometimes we observe why in certain family there is a kind of like a pattern, because the child actually sees the father, and that's something that I recognize in my life. Being a father myself, when I interact with my son, there are certain behaviors I see is basically a mirror image. Sometimes my wife say that you are just like your father. Is a typical phrase. So the child doesn't just become like the father, but the child learns from the behavior of the father. So that is really, really important to distinguish between a genetic predisposition versus a learned behavior.
Wonderful. Good to know that. So that's it. Why we are talking about men and anger, because I think more men. I mean, there are angry women, definitely. I think as long as you're a human being, you are capable of feeling this anger. But I think particularly for men, we do struggle with this in this area because I guess maybe it's how we were brought up and what we have been learning, very subtly and very unconsciously from society, that we're not supposed to express too much emotions, and therefore we are forced to keep it in, suppress it, and therefore later on in life it all comes out the wrong way. And therefore recently we had an episode on men who use violence against their spouses and their children, and so we have all these kind of problems, including crime, and also sexual assaults and things like that, right? So yes, okay, so it's a learned behavior. It's not in the genes necessarily, and so it is something that we can do, change and become a different person. I will testify to that because I used to be a very, very angry person, and it had to do with my childhood. Something happened in my family between my parents, and therefore I grew up with a lot of insecurities, and insecurities translated into this tendency to become perfectionistic. And so I get angry when things don't go as planned, when things go wrong, and when I'm just a little bit irritated and annoyed, I get very, very angry. And it also, I kind of took it out on my kids. So that was something I had to deal with, and I can say that I think it's quite mostly dealt with. So today I'm not so angry. I still get angry, but I'm not that kind of beyond anger and going into rage and things like that.
Right.
So anger is not necessarily a bad thing. It only becomes bad when what happens?
When you find, or maybe I'll put it this way, it becomes a problem when you cannot manage your anger. Whereby, let's say, for example, in the case whereby you're angry with maybe your subordinate, and you know that you are displeased with the way he or she does a particular task, but because you cannot manage your anger, you start to actually shout at her or shout at him, and that creates a lot of trauma for the person and also for yourself. So that's what we call unmanaged, uncontrollable anger. And sometimes uncontrollable anger can go into this way whereby the anger comes out not just in a voice or verbally, it can translate to physical. So I'll put it in this way, simply, right? Anger that's not managed, it becomes a problem. Anger that's managed is just an emotion.
Wow, that's very easy to understand. Yeah. So later we'll talk about what are some of the methods we can use to manage our anger. So let's take a short commercial break, because here is where I want to be telling our listeners that we have a surprise for you, something good for you. We are speaking with Eugene Chong from Seeding Minds today on the topic of anger. And if you feel that you are indeed struggling with anger in your life and need help, please, please, please do not hesitate to get in touch with Eugene at Seeding Minds. You can find the link in the show notes later on. Use the promo code WADT20 to get a 20% discount for your first two counseling sessions with Seeding Minds. All right. Now, the code is valid till 31st July, which means that the two sessions must be held before 31st of July 2022. And now back to the program. All right. So Eugene, let's talk about, where does anger come from? I mean, okay, anger is an emotion and we're all born with emotions, right? But we're talking about more than just that emotion of anger, where we really, it really makes us do things that we don't want to do. Where does it come from? How does it develop?
Well, actually, honestly, the reason why anger becomes or surface up, right? There are many possibility. So there are many factors. So it could be a part of your family dynamics that you grew up with, but it's also is a way that is also a what we call a personality trait. Some people they tend to be a bit more easily angered because of a certain trait that's within them that they find it hard to manage. So it is a trait, although earlier I did mention a point is that it's not something you're born with specifically. So there's no a specific gene that contribute to the anger or that's directly related to anger. But I would say that that kind of trait, right, in terms of your personal profile, does have an impact on how you relate or how you express your anger. And perhaps, right, people who are a little bit more domineering in that nature, if we are looking at DISC, then perhaps, right, the tendency for them to express anger in a more louder manner tends to be present. So this could be one of the factor.
Yeah, I do have a loud voice, so people might think that I'm always angry when I talk, Yeah, but actually no, I'm not. I'm not always angry.
Correct. So
Yeah.
so this is probably, I would say, one of the possible factors, but it may not be the only thing. So normally when we look at the entire whole person, right, when for the individual to really express a uncontrollable anger, there are just too many factors to consider. So it's not just the singular or unilateral factor in this case.
So I guess it's also triggered and compounded by, deeper issues, personal emotional issues, like maybe unmet expectations, or maybe
Yeah.
there's a conflict. Now, conflict, when we talk about conflict, I'm aware that there are actually maybe two types of conflict. One is the interpersonal conflict, and the other conflict is when, the reality is not matching with your dream or your expectation. So there is a conflict already. And so, people may feel, oh, I'm a failure, or, I need to, I'm not meeting up to expectations, and, it maybe creates anxiety and stress in them, and therefore it kind of makes things worse, and they become, when they are not able to manage all these emotions, then it kind of expresses in the form of anger.
Yeah.
So, Eugene, I thought I want to ask you a bit on the physiology of anger. Right? So, I understand that when someone's angry, certain things happening to their brain and affects the body. Apparently, from my research, there's this chemical called ne- norepinephrine.
This is called
Norepinephrine.
the non-adrenaline hormone.
Yeah, correct. So that's the same as
Yeah,
the adrenaline, right? The
yeah,
flight,
yeah,
flight.
yeah.
So while this kind of emotion, right, is necessary sometimes for us to respond to danger, respond to a certain situation.
Mm,
And for example, I mean, in when we are competing, right? We need adrenaline. When
yeah.
we are trying to achieve a certain goal, we need some of these things to fight. It's difficult. So it needs that kind of emotions. But at the same
Mm,
time, when too much of it, all right, what happens to the body, and how can it become like a disorder or become something that one
mm.
suffers from? Is it possible from
Yeah,
having too
yeah.
many anger episodes?
Yes. Okay. Okay. Having anger or having anger episode does not qualify for any specific disorder, but it becomes a symptom of some possible disorders. Maybe let's look at it in this way that when there's an elevation of a certain hormone, right? Actually, in our human body, whenever there's an excessive amount of certain items or certain chemicals, right, it tends to be quite dangerous because excessive doesn't help it to be balanced because our body is created in a way that it is allowing itself to be in a homeostatic kind of system, means that it's balanced. So anything that's excessive or lack of, right, it will become a problem to a human himself or herself. So in this case, right, when there's elevation of this type of hormones, we tend to be more agitated. We tend to respond more quicker, and sometimes we don't really process through our prefrontal lobe. Our mind doesn't really process through because our emotions are hijacking the ability to make judgment and assertion. So that's an issue that sometimes people experience when they are having an anger outburst. Yeah, so we cannot logically kind of like make a good judgment.
So it's
Yeah, that,
related
that's
to
something
when.
like temporary insanity, isn't it?
I mean, you can call that, yeah, I mean, yeah, possible, but normally I don't use that term. I would say that the person is at a point whereby they are kind of freeze. They don't know what to do, and that's where the anger takes over them. They become so angry, and this anger is not easily kind of say cool down. Like for example, if we talk about fire, there are certain degree of fire, right? No matter how much things that you put in, right, all the water you put in, right, you will find it really, really hard to kind of quench your fire down because it's too massive. It requires even more other intervention in order for the fire to be quenched down.
So in a way, it becomes like unstoppable. I mean, when there's too
Yeah,
much of it. The other one that I want to relate is probably when it is the autopilot, right? I mean, you cannot control it because it's been a habit, become a habit that
yeah,
that's how
yeah.
we respond.
Correct.
Yes.
So it's like a conditioning. So you are being conditioned that whenever you face with a situation, you react in this way. And typically, what we always observe, right? What I typically observe is that anger outbursts, right? Most of the time happens within the family. Like for example, you seldom see men outburst or experience anger outbursts in your workplace. I think there's a reason for that, because you see, as what Pastor mentioned, right? There's a lot of unmet expectation, intrapersonal unmet expectation. Also, when a man is working, the way their mind is wired is that this is my work. I'm a professional. That I work in certain areas, and this is my livelihood. So the way I respond is much more controlled. But when I go back to the home, I assume that this is my, I would say, safe place, a place that I can be myself. So if I have an anger issue as the underlying basis, right, when I go back home, I tend to find it easier to have this outburst or just be easy to myself. And when there's any trigger, any very minor trigger, like for example, your kids could be calling you one or two times, you start to become irritable. Then like irritation translate to a little bit of like frustration. Then you become angry.
Yeah.
Mm.
To the extent that when this happens, right? I think it's related to when we feel stress. Then you will have sleep disruption, or even sometimes other things are also disrupted, even social functioning. So how to how extent that anger can lead to such conditions?
Well, if let's say this individual is really, really having a lot of like repressed anger, there's a possibility that it affects all areas of their life. So once this anger episode affects all various areas of their life, social, family, work, and other areas, their personal hobbies, right? Then it will tend to qualify for a possible diagnosis of some other condition, because anger itself is a symptom of other conditions.
So from your experience, right? I'm sure if you need help, when is actually the good time, for you to get help if someone realize that he has anger management issues. I mean, you don't wait until
Well,
you abuse someone, right? That's too late,
yeah.
really. You know.
Well, I mean, okay. Okay. Ideally, it will be as soon as possible, as early as possible. Once you recognize that you do have anger issue, seek treatment. That's ideal. But in reality, right, most of my patients, when they come and look for me, is whereby the situation has become quite bad. That's where they seek treatment. So whether they have abusive relationship, or they have like uncontrollable anger in their family, or they could have like workplace violence as well. So things of
Yeah.
such.
You are listening to the WADT podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe so that you will not miss any episodes. Share the link to this episode with someone you think that will benefit from it. We want to know what you think of this episode too. Please feel free to share your comments on one of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also email wearedebts2@gmail.com if you have a question or need help. And now, back to the program.
I would say that, if you notice that you are easily irritable, and easily, flustered, okay, and people say, your feathers are ruffled, and yeah. So even then, and these are the beginnings of, a habit and a tendency to become more and more angry. So my personal advice, as someone who has actually gone through that, all right, I would say that, when you are already at that stage and noticing it, it's good to find some kind of help, whether it's talking to someone, whether it be a friend or therapist, all right, so that you can begin to explore and examine what's inside, what's underneath, what's the undercurrent. Because for most men, anger is a secondary thing. There's something underlying. If you imagine an iceberg, what you see on the surface is anger, but what's underneath, it's even greater. There are deeper issues, and if you just learn to count to 10, you are only dealing with the symptom but not the root cause. Okay, so I would really encourage men, don't delay. It's no shame. All right, anger is it can be turned into something positive, because like what Hafiz said, it's an energy. And if you direct it, if you're in control in the first place, if you are in control of your anger, which is a form of energy, then you're able to direct it in a positive way and bring about positive outcomes. But if you are not in control, then who knows what can happen. So do not take the risk. My advice to men is, don't take the risk. Talk to someone about it. Okay, the sooner the better.
So anger affects your life, definitely. Even if we don't wait until anger becomes violence, anger becomes abusive. I sometimes observe some people, men especially, anger becomes part of their personality. Part of their psyche. I mean, they're angry with everything. Angry with the left, the right, the climate. Everyone. So it becomes part of their personality. And the problem is they can't see it. Even if you tell them, "Why are you so angry?" It's affecting a lot of things. Not just you, about your relationship with people and so on. And it doesn't solve anything. So again, there's a need for us to realize that whatever level of anger, such that it affects even a bit of our life, as Eugene mentioned, we have to seek for some kind of intervention. So in that spirit, what are the kind of preventive strategies that you can share, to for us men and boys, to prevent anger?
I think for boys, maybe you put it at, I will just anger for boys. I think it's important to have a very positive relationship in your family. I think that is the crux, because a lot of men who has grown up, they start to experience anger issue. Actually, it starts from their growing up years. The way the dynamics of the family, the way they communicate, the way things are being actually expressed. So all these things kind of contribute to the way anger is being learned. So I would say for boys, learn to communicate calmly to your parents and learn to have time that you can actually bond with them. So for parents as well, when your kids are young, learn to spend time with them, because that is the point whereby you inculcate a good anger management strategy. Yeah, it's through your life, because anger will always occur here and there, but it's how you manage. So let's say, for example, in a situation whereby you are angry and you are in the midst of exploding, but you learn to cope with the anger and your child sees it, and that's where you learn. So there's nothing wrong having that almost immediate one wanted to burst, but you learn to actually calm it back. That's why they learn how my father, how my mother does it. So this is really important. Well, besides that, for fathers, how can we actually intervene and cope immediately? Let's say if we do experience an anger kind of like situation, I think importantly is that you need to be aware whether do you really have an anger issue, like what was mentioned, right? Sometimes we are some men, they just don't, they are not ready, they are not aware. So which means that they are at a point that they are not ready to understand what's going on. So I think as friends, as therapists, we help them to identify. So sometimes, right, in therapy, we want to show them faces of people feeling angry and how do they feel when they look at people in such a video expressing anger. So sometimes it takes some time for them to have that revelation. So it's not immediate. So you will not be the point whereby you just tell them, oh, you have an anger issue. They will start to, oh, really? Most of our time, it takes a couple of sessions, a couple of months before they start to recognize, yes, I do have an anger issue.
Yeah, because it's become normal to them, and they are, in a sense, they've forgotten what normal behavior really looks like. And so to them, their behavior is normal. All right, they've lived with this for so long, it's become normal to them. And so they say, well, yeah, why are you so angry with him? Well, of course, because he's done this and he's done that. All right, so there's always a reason for it, and therefore it justifies your behavior. And then it just continues. And so you're right to say it takes time. It really sometimes, some people just may not even be able to see it, right?
Correct.
So if that's why we need to have trusted friends around us who will be very honest, ruthlessly honest with us, so that they will tell us, all right, what as they see it. And if you trust the guy, you trust this friend of yours, and he or she tells you that you have an anger issue, please listen.
Don't be angry.
Don't be defensive, and says,
Right.
really? Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the techniques? Maybe some of the techniques, to close our podcast. I mean, what are the techniques that we can use personally, to overcome anger?
Okay. A very immediate technique would be, I will say to all the men, if you are feeling a sense of surge of anger, immediately close your eyes for about 3 seconds. Okay, take a few deep breaths, then remove yourself from the situation. Don't stay there. That could be in a situation whereby you are having a tension with your spouse, or your kids, or your family, or your parents, or whoever that might be. Take a withdraw from the situation. That will be, I would say, to my experience and to my training, will be a good way to start off with. Because if you don't withdraw, the more you stay in a situation, the more you interact, the more you, I would say, logicalize yourself, you tend to go into maybe an escalation. Because maybe you will say A, the other person will say B, then you say C, and you continue to escalate. There's no point whereby you're able to logically look at the situation objectively.
I just read something just from the Facebook just now. I know this happens in Japan, where they have a place where people can just smash things, to vent their anger. So I saw this particular one latest in Malaysia. I'm not sure in Singapore we have. What do you think of that? Letting it out.
Singapore used to have one. I think Singapore, we used to have a place where you can smash computers,
Yes.
glass. Yeah, there is. But I think because of COVID, I think it has been closed down. I'm not too sure about that. Well, I mean, generally, one of the myths that people might have is that maybe we should have a catharsis of anger. We just want to vent our anger. We probably find a place to smash things. Maybe for a brief moment, it might help because it allows us to feel more relaxed. Because after smashing, right, your energy is lost. I think that's a good way. But sometimes, right, what we recognize that the more you do it, the more you use it as the way, so-called the way. So, for example, if I were to continue to use this method of like manage my anger, every time I have an anger issue, I need to smash things. They will come to a point whereby you are not able to go to this particular place, this special place where they created for you to smash things. What then will you do? Are there other things that you may want to smash when you're in office, when you're at home? Because it's a behavior to learn. It's the easiest. It helps you to relieve the so-called the anger issue. Just like taking a pill, it relieves that kind of anger issue. So in that case, is that the good way to do it in long term? Probably not. Yeah. So that's where I think that converting the energy to something more positive, as what Freud mentioned, right? We try to convert the energy of the anger, the aggression, to something that helps your body. It could be an exercise. So that's the reason why many doctors, many clinical professionals, they say, go and exercise. Because exercise relieve your tension. It helps your muscle to relax, and also it kind of like dissipate the anger, the stress that's within you. So therefore, I think, right, as what was mentioned, right, doing all these things helps the surface, but eventually, you need to go deeper to find out what is the root cause, and you need to tackle that memory, the cause that created the anger, because anger is an unmet expectation that you express in this form. So that's the important part of therapy when you work on this issue that probably got to do with your past.
Yeah.
Well, we are very thankful that we have people like Eugene, from Seeding Minds and, private practices like theirs who are always available to help people who are struggling with different issues in their lives. So remember, if you are a listener to this podcast, you can use the promo code WADT20, stands for 20, and you can get a 20% discount for your first 2 visits to Seeding Minds. All right, and the code is valid till 31st of July, which means the 2 sessions must happen before the 31st of July. All right, we'll put the link to Seeding Minds in our show notes, and we'll see you back next week. And Eugene will be with us again to talk about a different issue that men often struggle with. This is the WADT podcast, and thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe so that you will not miss any episodes. Share the link to this episode with someone you think that will benefit from it. We want to know what you think of this episode too. Please feel free to share your comments on one of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also email wearedads2@gmail.com if you have a question or need help. Till the next time, this is Hafiz and Parkson signing off.